The sea raged beneath the blackened sky, waves rising like restless beasts hungry for destruction. Captain Dane Marrow stood at the helm of the Black Zephyr, his sharp, sea-weathered face set in stone. His coat, tattered from years of salt and battle, billowed behind him as he steered the ship through the storm. Rain lashed his skin like needles, but his piercing gray eyes never wavered. He had known the ocean's wrath since boyhood. He did not fear it. But tonight, something was different. Lightning split the heavens, and for a moment, the world flashed silver. That was when he saw it, a figure caught between the waves, drifting, sinking. A mermaid. She was unlike any Dane had ever heard of in sailors' tales. Her scales shimmered like moonlight upon the tide, silver and blue, shifting with every movement. Her long, flowing hair tangled with strands of seaweed, wrapping around her delicate face, her lips parted as if whispering a final plea. She was drowning. A cursed thought. It was said that mermaids never drowned. Dane did not think. He leaped overboard. The sea swallowed him whole. Cold crushed against him, but he fought through the current, reaching for her. His arms wrapped around her fragile form, her body weightless in the dark water. He kicked, pushing upward, lungs burning, salt filling his throat. Finally, they broke the surface. Above, his crew shouted, ropes thrown into the churning sea. Dane barely heard them. The mermaid's head rested against his chest, her breaths shallow, her skin icy against his warmth. "Hold on, lass," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You're not dying tonight." Hands gripped his arms, pulling him back onto the Black Zephyr. The mermaid lay motionless on the deck, the rain washing over her like the sea still claimed her. Dane knelt beside her, brushing wet strands from her face. Her features were hauntingly beautiful, too ethereal for this world. But her lips were pale, her chest barely rising. "She's cursed, Captain," growled Ravik, his first mate, a man with a scar running from temple to jaw. "Best we toss her back before she takes us all with her." "Since when did we fear myths?" Dane snapped. He pressed his ear to her lips, searching for breath. "She's alive, and I won't let her die." Ignoring Ravik's warnings, he tilted her chin, pressing his lips against hers to breathe life into her lungs. He had seen enough men drown to know that sometimes the sea only needed a reason to let go. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a gasp, the mermaid's body arched, water spilling from her lips. Her eyes, deep, endless blue, fluttered open. Dane had seen storms, had faced the fury of kings and monsters alike, but nothing in this world had ever stolen his breath the way her gaze did. A shuddering breath escaped her. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Dane murmured. "For now." The mermaid's gaze flickered past him, to the crew that circled her like wolves. She tried to move, but her strength had abandoned her. "What's your name?" Dane asked. She hesitated, as if the answer had been stolen from her. Then, at last, she whispered, "Silara." Silara, a name like the tide itself, soft yet endless. Before Dane could speak, a distant sound cut through the storm, the haunting call of a ship's horn. His blood ran cold. Lord Vaedrus of the Dagger Tides had found them. And now he wanted what lay upon Dane's deck. The battle for the mermaid had begun. The night was heavy with mist as the Black Zephyr sailed into the shadowed port of Harrod's Hollow, a place whispered about in sailors' tales, an eerie haven where secrets were bought and sold beneath the veil of fog. The harbor stank of salt and decay, but it was the only place Dane could rest for now. Silara, still pale from the sea's grasp, was weak but no longer dying. Her once icy skin had warmed beneath Dane's care, though she remained silent, her ocean blue eyes distant, haunted. The crew set anchor, murmuring beneath their breath as they unloaded their spoils. Dane stood at the bow, watching the towering cliffs that loomed over them, like silent sentinels guarding the forgotten. His mind churned with the words Ravik had spoken just hours before, words he couldn't shake. "The sea's curse will drown her. Keep her close, Captain, or you'll be the next one who falls." He would not let her fall. But as he turned to check on her, the soft sound of footsteps reached his ears. Maricel, the ship's cook and a longtime friend of Dane's, approached him, carrying a silver tray adorned with a dark red chalice. She was a large woman with a hearty laugh, her black hair braided tightly against her head, her eyes the color of storm clouds. But tonight, her expression was grave, something about her smile strained. "I'd brought you something special," she said, her voice too sweet to be trusted. "From a friend. Or foe. The merchant from the far eastern islands, the one we met in the bay. He thought you might enjoy a drink of his finest wine." Dane glanced at the chalice, its ruby contents shimmering in the dim light. His gut tightened. The merchant had been too kind, too eager. He didn't trust kindness, especially not in a place like Harrow's Hollow. Maricel held the chalice out, her hands trembling slightly. Dane eyed it carefully. It was a rare wine, known for its ability to sedate even the wildest of beasts. But why would it be given now? Celera's voice broke the moment. Soft and distant, it was almost a whisper carried by the wind. "Do not drink it." Dane turned to her, startled. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with something more than concern. Fear. "It is poisoned," she said. Dane felt a chill in his spine. Slowly, he reached out and took the chalice from Maricel, his grip firm, but his gaze never leaving Celera. "Poisoned?" he asked, his voice low. Maricel's expression faltered for the briefest moment. "I assure you, Captain, it's nothing like that. A gift, nothing more." She stepped closer, her eyes glinting in a way that sent an unsettling tingle up his neck. A good drink for a man who has fought so hard to survive. The air between them grew thick. Dane knew the game now. This was no mere drink. This was betrayal. Before he could speak, a shadow loomed over them. Ravik, his first mate, stepping from the shadows with a warning in his eyes. "It's a trap, Captain," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "The merchant's men are here. They've been watching us." Dane didn't waste a moment. He tossed the chalice to the deck, smashing it into pieces. Maricel's face twisted in fury, but she didn't have time to react. Ravik lunged, grabbing her wrist in one swift motion. "Who are you working for, Maricel?" Dane demanded, his voice a low growl. She wrenched her arm free, but her gaze turned cold, her expression unreadable. "You've made a powerful enemy, Captain," she sneered, backing away. "The man who hired me doesn't take kindly to being refused." The air grew tense. Dane could almost feel the weight of the poison lingering in the shattered chalice on the deck, the threat of death curling like smoke around them. But he couldn't waste time on this. Celera needed him. Turning to her, Dane found her sitting near the railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sight of her, the sorrow in her eyes, the weight of the curse she carried, pierced his heart. She had saved him, yet here she was, still a prisoner of the sea's rage, and now a target for those who sought to control her. He kneeled beside her, his voice low, filled with resolve. "I won't let them take you. Not now. Not ever." Her eyes met his, her lips trembling slightly. "Dane," she whispered, "you have no idea what you've just stepped into." But Dane, looking into her eyes, knew only one thing with certainty. She was not alone anymore. And neither was he. The sea was not kind that night. It rolled and churned like a beast beneath a sky filled with dark clouds, swallowing the light of the moon. Dane stood at the edge of the black zephyr, staring into the endless horizon where the storm met the ocean's heart. His brow furrowed, and his knuckles whitened around the wheel as the wind howled around him. He had always sailed in storms, but this one was different. The waves rose higher than usual, crashing against the ship with a deafening roar, as if the ocean itself was trying to warn him away. Beside him, Celera stood, her pale skin glowing faintly against the darkness, her silver hair whipping wildly around her face. She seemed unbothered by the fury of the storm, her eyes fixed on the sea below, lost in the depths of some faraway thought. Her beauty had an ethereal quality, but there was a sorrow about her now that Dane hadn't seen before. He knew what it was. Fear. Her voice was barely a whisper, carried away by the wind. The abyssal trench. It calls to me, Dane. He turned to her, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. The abyssal trench. The very name struck terror in the hearts of sailors. It was a place of ancient, unfathomable magic, a place where even the bravest ships and men had been lost without a trace. But the storm, the crashing waves, the wild current, all of it seemed to be guiding them there, pulling them toward the heart of darkness. "We don't have to go," Dane said softly, his voice rough with the uncertainty that gnawed at him. He had known many dangerous places, many deadly waters. But this felt different. This was something ancient, something beyond the world he knew. Solara's gaze softened as she turned to him. Her eyes, vast and endless, like the ocean itself, searched his face with a look that seemed to pierce right through him. "I'm afraid it's too late, Dane. We must go. If I stay away from it any longer, the curse will claim me completely." Dane swallowed hard. There was no escaping this. There never had been. His hands clenched the wheel tighter, his heart racing with the storm's fury. But even in the chaos of the ocean, he could not look away from her. Solara's beauty was haunting, but it was the sadness in her eyes that drew him in, that tied him to her. She was both his salvation and his doom. "Then we go," he said firmly, his voice low and steady, like the ocean itself. He didn't hesitate. He would go with her wherever she needed to go, even into the very heart of the abyss. As the Black Zephyr pushed forward through the storm, the crew scrambled below deck, the wind tearing at the sails, and the waves crashing against the ship's sides. Dane kept his eyes locked on the horizon, his thoughts consumed by Solara. The sea was testing them, and he knew it. This was no ordinary storm, no ordinary journey. The magic that surrounded Solara, the curse that clung to her like a shadow, it was all tied to the ocean, to the very heart of the abyss they were now sailing toward. Solara approached him, her bare feet barely making a sound against the wet deck. She was like a ghost in the storm, her presence both calming and unnerving at the same time. Her voice was soft as she spoke, but there was a strange certainty to it. "I was born of the ocean, Dane, but I was never meant to be part of this world. The trench, it is my only chance to break free from what I've become. It's the only place where I might find peace." Dane didn't know how to respond to that. How could he, when all he could see was the torment in her eyes, the pain she carried with every breath? She was a creature of the sea, born of its depths, but the curse that bound her to its call was slowly drowning her, and he had foolishly believed he could save her. He reached out, gently brushing a lock of her silver hair behind her ear. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm with you. We'll face whatever comes together." Her eyes met his, searching his face as if looking for the truth in his words. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stood there, the storm raging around them. Finally, she nodded, a small, weary smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she whispered. The wind howled, but in that moment, the world seemed to quiet around them. The ship creaked and groaned beneath their feet, but it was just the two of them standing there, on the edge of everything, bound by fate, by the sea, and by something deeper, something that neither of them could name. Together, they sailed into the unknown, into the abyss. The abyssal trench loomed ahead like a mouth of darkness, a yawning chasm beneath the waves. The sea had calmed somewhat, but there was an unnatural stillness that clung to the air. It was as though the ocean itself was holding its breath. Dane stood at the bow of the Black Zephyr, his eyes locked on the vast, dark expanse before him. The trench was close, too close. Solara stood beside him, her silver hair gleaming faintly in the moonlight, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The weight of her presence beside him was impossible to ignore. She was both an enigma and a siren, a creature of the ocean whose beauty and mystery captivated him, yet whose curse threatened to pull them both into the depths. Her eyes, deep and endless like the sea, seemed lost in the trench's pull, drawn to the place where the ocean's secrets whispered in forgotten tongues. "It's here," Solara whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft lapping of the waves against the ship's hull. "I can feel it. The pull." Dane turned to her, his expression serious. He could feel it too, the cold, unnatural weight in the air. He could see the way the water shifted, swirling as if some great force below had awakened. This was the heart of the ocean's mysteries, a place where no man or mermaid had ever returned unchanged. The very thought of it filled him with dread, but he could not turn back now, not when Solara needed him most. "Are you sure?" Dane asked, his voice low. He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm, trying to offer comfort, but she flinched as if the touch had sent a spark through her. "I have no choice," she said softly, though there was a hardness in her voice, something he had not heard before. "The curse has already begun to change me, Dane. If I stay away much longer, it will consume me. The trench, it is the only place where I can be free." Dane's heart ached as he watched her, the pain in her eyes cutting deeper than the cold winds whipping around them. He wanted to promise her that everything would be fine, that they would find a way to break the curse, but deep down, he knew the truth. The trench was not a place of salvation. It was a place of sacrifice, and no one who entered ever left the same. Solara's gaze softened as she turned to face him, her ocean blue eyes locking with his. For a moment, the world seemed to still around them, the storm forgotten, the ship forgotten. It was just the two of them, alone on the edge of everything. "I'm afraid, Dane," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Not of what lies beneath the sea, but of what it will do to you, to us." He shook his head, stepping closer to her. "You don't need to be afraid, Solara. I won't let anything happen to you." Her eyes searched his face, studying him as if looking for something she had yet to find. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the ship lurched. The air around them seemed to shift, and the sea began to churn once more. Waves, dark and violent, rose from the depths, crashing against the ship with a fury that nearly knocked Dane off his feet. Solara gasped, her hand flying to the railing for support. "It's calling to me," she whispered, her voice full of awe and fear. "The trench, it's calling me home." Dane grabbed her wrist, his grip firm. "Don't listen to it," he urged, his eyes locked on her, willing her to stay with him. "We don't have to do this." But Solara only shook her head, her silver hair swirling around her face like the storm itself. "I have to," she said, her voice hardening with resolve. "This is my destiny, Dane. I can feel it. The trench is the only place where I can break free from the curse. I was born to this." The ship groaned as the waves battered it mercilessly, and the sky above seemed to darken even further. The pull of the trench grew stronger, a tug at Dane's very soul. He could feel it too, like an ancient power calling to them both, but he refused to let it claim her. He had fought storms and battles, but nothing in his life had prepared him for the fear that clenched his heart now. "Solara," he said, his voice rough, "I don't care what the trench promises. I care about you. You're not alone in this." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw something that nearly broke him. She wanted to stay. He could see it in the way her lips trembled, in the way her body swayed toward him like a leaf caught in the wind. But there was something else, something deeper than the love she had begun to feel for him, a bond with the ocean that she could not deny. With a final glance, Solara turned away, her hand slipping from his. The trench awaited, and though his heart bled at the thought of losing her, Dane knew this was the only path left for her. Together, they sailed toward the heart of the abyss. The trench was alive. Its pulse echoed through the very air, a deep, resonating hum that seemed to seep into Dane's bones. The black zephyr crept ever closer to the edge of the abyss, the ship rocking gently as though it, too, could feel the pull of the depths. The water below had turned an unnatural shade of black, a darkness so deep that even the stars could not penetrate it. It was as though the very ocean itself was swallowing the light. Silura stood at the bow, her silver hair fluttering in the wind, her eyes fixed on the swirling darkness ahead. The storm had subsided, but an eerie calm had taken its place, thick and suffocating. She was drawn to it, the call of the trench too powerful for her to ignore. Dane could see it in her eyes, the way her gaze drifted over the water with a longing, as though the sea itself was calling her home. He approached her, his boots creaking against the wet deck, but she didn't move. The chill of the night air seemed to press in around them, the silence between them hanging heavy. Her expression was distant, lost in the pull of the deep, and for a moment, Dane wondered if he had lost her already. She was a creature of the sea, but he had hoped. No, he had prayed, that there might be some way to save her from this fate. "Silura," he said softly, his voice barely louder than the lapping of the waves. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath his touch. "We don't have to do this. There has to be another way." She turned her head slightly, her ocean blue eyes meeting his. There was a sadness in them, but also something else, something deeper, older, a truth that neither of them could deny. "I have to, Dane," she whispered. "The trench. It is where I belong. It is where my soul is tied. If I do not answer its call, I will be consumed by the curse. It is the only way to break free." Dane's heart twisted in his chest. He had never wanted anything more than to keep her safe, to pull her away from this. But he knew, deep down, there was no turning back. This was her path, one that she had been walking long before they had met. The sea had claimed her, and now it was time for her to return to it. "You're not just the ocean's creature, Silura," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are more than that. You are the woman I care for, the woman I love." Her eyes softened at his words, and for a moment, it was as though the weight of the curse lifted from her. She reached out and took his hand, her touch light, but full of an overwhelming sadness. "I love you too, Dane," she said, her voice trembling. "But there is no escaping what I am. The sea has always been my home, and it always will be." Dane closed his eyes, pressing his forehead to hers. The world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of their breathing, the rhythm of their hearts beating in time with the pulse of the ocean. For a long moment, they stood there, holding each other, knowing that the world was changing around them. The trench was now only a heartbeat away. It called to them both. One, to claim what it had long ago promised. The other, to face the truth of what it meant to love someone bound to the sea. Suddenly, the water beneath the ship began to churn violently. The black zephyr creaked and groaned as the waves rose high, crashing against the hull with a deafening roar. The air grew thick, heavy with an otherworldly pressure that seemed to draw everything toward the depths. The ship began to tilt dangerously as the water swirled, as though the very ocean itself was trying to pull them under. Dane's grip tightened around Silura's hand. "We need to go," he shouted above the roar of the storm. But Silura stood still, her gaze unblinking as she looked toward the depths. "Don't fight it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos around them. "This is where I belong." The ship lurched again, and Dane was forced to grab hold of the railing to steady himself. The water was rising quickly, and the trench's pull was undeniable now. Silura, though, seemed almost serene, her eyes closed as though listening to something only she could hear, something ancient, powerful, and inescapable. "Dane," she murmured, her voice soft and almost peaceful now. "I will always be with you, no matter what happens. You will carry me with you, in your heart, as the sea carries me home." With that, she stepped forward, her silver hair gleaming in the storm's fury, and without another word, she vanished into the roiling blackness below. Dane stood frozen, the storm deafening in his ears, the loss of her like a gaping wound in his chest. But he could not. would not let her go. Not without a fight. Not without her. He would follow her into the abyss if he had to. He had no choice. With a final glance at the now still waters, he followed her. Into the depths. The world was no longer above him. The black zephyr was gone, swallowed whole by the abyss. Dane's heart pounded in his chest as he sank deeper into the ocean's crushing embrace. The cold water surrounded him like a living thing, wrapping around him, pulling him down into the vast unknown. His lungs burned as he fought against the pressure, his body protesting. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when she was so close. Solara's figure had disappeared into the dark waters before him, her silver hair shining like a trail of moonlight as she glided into the depths. She was a part of this world, a creature born of the ocean's heart. Dane, on the other hand, was only a man, a pirate bound to the surface. Yet here he was, diving into the depths for her, willing to give everything to bring her back to him. The sea was a living, breathing entity, its currents tugging and swirling around him like hungry serpents. Dane's eyes struggled to adjust to the murky water. But there, just beneath the surface, he saw her. She was waiting, her figure barely visible, floating like a ghost. Her eyes, deep and sorrowful, locked onto his as she sensed him near. "Solara," Dane shouted, his voice lost in the water. He pushed forward, kicking through the currents with all his strength. His movements were sluggish, the weight of the ocean pressing in on him, but nothing could stop him now. He wouldn't let the sea take her without a fight. Her face twisted in a mixture of sorrow and acceptance as he reached her, his hand brushing against hers. The cold shock of her touch sent a shiver through him. She looked at him with an expression that said everything. This was the end. She was no longer the same woman he had met, no longer the mermaid who had swum with him under the stars. The ocean had claimed her, and now it was time for her to go. Why? Dane's voice came out hoarse and strained, his breath shallow in the water. His chest tightened with every word he spoke, every second they spent together in this inescapable world. "Why did you leave me?" Solara's lips parted, but her voice was drowned by the ocean around them. She reached up, her delicate fingers brushing his face in a gesture both tender and heartbreaking. Her gaze was soft, but there was an undeniable sadness in her eyes. "I was born to the sea, Dane," she whispered, her words slipping through the water like a dream. "This is my fate, my curse. I cannot escape it, no matter how much I want to. The trench is where I must go. It is where I was meant to be." The darkness around them seemed to grow deeper, more suffocating, as if the ocean itself was listening to her words, agreeing with them. The currents around them began to shift, as though the sea was urging her away from him, urging her toward the very heart of the abyss. But Dane would not let her go. He reached for her, grabbing her wrist with desperate strength, pulling her toward him. His heart raced in his chest, the weight of the water pressing in, but he couldn't let her slip away, not without a fight. He couldn't lose her, not like this. "You don't belong in the trench," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You belong with me. We belong together. Please, Solara, come back to me." Her eyes flickered with a fleeting spark of hesitation, as if something inside her stirred at his words. For a moment, she hesitated, and Dane's heart surged with hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could escape the ocean's grip. But then her face fell, and the deep sorrow returned. The sea's power was too much. She closed her eyes, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper, just a soft, aching sound beneath the water. "You can't save me, Dane," she said. "This is who I am. You have to let me go." The current around them surged violently, pulling her away from him. Dane's hand slipped from hers as the water began to drag her further down, deeper into the trench. He tried to reach for her again, but the ocean was stronger. It was too late. With one final, heart-wrenching look, Solara vanished into the blackness, swallowed by the depths. Dane was left alone in the crushing silence, his body heavy with the weight of the water and his heart heavier with the weight of his loss. For a moment, everything was still, the ocean eerily calm. He sank further into the depths, his chest aching, but a fierce fire burned in his heart. He would not let her go, not like this. The ocean may have claimed her, but he would fight until his last breath to bring her back. He would go into the heart of the abyss itself if that's what it took. The sea was darker than Dane had ever known. The ocean had swallowed him whole, pulling him deeper than he ever thought possible. The water was thick with the weight of ancient secrets, and with every passing moment, the pressure threatened to crush him. His chest ached from the cold and the depth, but it was nothing compared to the ache in his heart. He had lost her. Solara had vanished beneath the waves, swallowed by the trench, and Dane could still feel her presence in the water around him. Her essence was woven into the very fabric of the sea. Unavoidable, undeniable. The thought of it was maddening. But he couldn't turn back. Not now. With each stroke, he fought the currents that sought to pull him deeper into the abyss, his muscles burning from the strain. The trench loomed ahead, a dark gash in the ocean floor that seemed to lead into the very heart of the world, a place so deep, so unfathomable, that few had ever returned to speak of it. But Dane was not afraid. Not anymore. Not with Solara's fate at stake. As the darkness of the trench swallowed him, he felt an ancient force tugging at him, urging him downward, as if the sea itself was both guiding and challenging him. He fought the pull, refusing to let the darkness take him without a fight. Ahead, a faint glow flickered through the blackness, and Dane's heart skipped a beat. Was it a sign? Was Solara there, waiting for him? He didn't know, but he swam toward it with a determination he hadn't known he had. The further he went, the colder it became, and the pressure of the water around him grew unbearable. Yet he pushed forward. The glow grew brighter as he approached, and soon he broke through the veil of darkness into a strange, luminous world. The trench was not empty. It was alive. Massive columns of coral and stone rose from the ocean floor, glowing with an ethereal light, casting shadows that danced and shifted as if the very walls of the abyss were breathing. Strange creatures, ancient and unknowable, swam around him, their translucent bodies weaving in and out of the glowing structures. Some of them resembled creatures from ancient myths, their eyes glowing like stars, their fins shimmering with the pale light of the deep. And then he saw her. Solara was not far away. She hovered at the center of the glowing abyss, her silver hair cascading around her like a shimmering veil, her body moving with an unnatural grace. Her eyes were closed, her expression peaceful, as though she had already given herself to the ocean. The curse had taken hold of her completely. "Solara!" Dane shouted, his voice piercing through the water, but it was lost in the vastness of the trench. His heart pounded as he swam toward her, but the closer he got, the more the water seemed to resist him. The very currents around him seemed to push him away, urging him to turn back. But he couldn't, not when she was so close. As he reached out for her, Solara's eyes opened, her gaze locking onto his. There was no recognition in her eyes, only a deep, sorrowful acceptance. She floated, suspended in the water, as though she was one with the trench itself. The curse was complete. The ocean had claimed her. "You shouldn't have come," Solara whispered, her voice echoing through his mind. "You cannot save me, Dane. The trench is my destiny." Dane's chest tightened as he reached for her once more, his hand trembling. "I don't care about destiny," he said, his voice desperate. "I care about you." Her eyes softened for a brief moment, but then the current around them shifted. The trench seemed to come alive, swirling with power, and the sea's depths roared like a beast awakening from a long slumber. "Dane, you don't understand," Solara murmured, her voice barely audible against the roar of the ocean. "I was born to the sea. This is who I am. I can't run from it. I can't escape it. You should have let me go." Dane's heart shattered, but he wouldn't let go. He couldn't. "I will never let you go," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "No matter what the sea tries to take from me, I won't lose you. I will fight for you. Always." For a moment, there was silence, an eerie calm that hung between them. The water around them stilled, and the glow from the coral cast a soft, shimmering light over Solara's face. Her expression softened, but there was no time for her to respond. The trench was shifting once more, its power growing, and the very ground beneath Dane's feet seemed to tremble. "Dane, no." Solara's voice was fading now, swallowed by the ocean's roar. "You can't." But Dane would not listen. He reached for her again, pulling her close despite the storm that raged around them. The ocean might try to pull them apart, but he would fight until his last breath to bring her back to him. And so, beneath the endless waves, they clung to each other, the world around them shuddering as the heart of the trench seemed to beat louder with every passing moment. The ocean was still. Dane floated in the heart of the trench, the currents gone silent, as if the sea itself held its breath. He clung to Solara, her silver hair tangled in his fingers, her fragile form pressed against his chest. Her eyes, once full of life, were now clouded, distant, her spirit fading with each passing moment. She had become one with the depths, and he knew, deep down, that this would be the last time he would hold her. He could feel the power of the trench, thick and heavy, like an ancient weight pressing down on them both. The ocean's pulse, once strong and vibrant, had turned to a slow, rhythmic thrum, an unstoppable force that neither of them could escape. But Dane refused to believe it was truly over. He had fought this far. He would not give in. "Solara," Dane whispered, his voice rough and strained, filled with an ache that he could no longer suppress. "Please, don't leave me." She stirred faintly in his arms, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, it seemed like she recognized him, like she was still the woman he had met on the shores, still the mermaid with the heart of the ocean. But the light in her eyes flickered, fading quickly, and Dane's heart sank. "I can't fight it any longer," she whispered, her voice as soft as a sigh. The words barely reached him through the weight of the water pressing against them, but he could hear the sorrow in her voice. "The sea has claimed me, Dane. It is my home. I have to stay." "No," he said firmly, his hand tightening around hers. "You are more than this, Solara. You're not just a creature of the sea. You are my heart. You are mine." She looked up at him, her gaze filled with such sadness, such love, that it nearly broke him. There was a peacefulness in her eyes now, a quiet acceptance of what was to come, and Dane felt the ocean's weight lift slightly from his chest. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't the ending he had imagined. He couldn't lose her, not like this. "I am yours," Solara said softly, her voice full of love. "But I can't stay in your world. My place is here, in the trench." Dane shook his head, his eyes brimming with tears. "I won't lose you, Solara. Not like this. I would follow you into the depths if it meant we could be together." The water around them trembled, as though the trench itself was responding to his words. The glow of the coral dimmed, casting the world in shadows, and the ocean seemed to pulse with a new restless energy. It was as if the sea was listening to him, pulling back for just a moment, allowing him the chance to speak his truth. "I love you," he said, his voice steady despite the overwhelming grief threatening to overtake him. "I always will." The words hung between them, floating in the water like a prayer, a promise. For a moment, everything was still. There was no storm, no current, just the sound of their hearts beating in time with the ocean's pulse. And in that moment, Solara's hand squeezed his, the faintest sign of life still within her. "I love you too," she whispered, and for a brief second, the sorrow in her eyes faded, replaced by a fleeting spark of joy. "I will carry you with me, always. In the sea, in the stars, in everything." Her words were soft, but they held a weight that Dane would carry with him for the rest of his life. She was slipping away from him, but somehow, in the depths of the trench, they were together. Their hearts were bound by something greater than the ocean itself. It was love, timeless and eternal. Dane held her close, feeling her body go limp in his arms as the trench pulled her deeper into its embrace. He didn't let go, not even as the darkness around them deepened, not even as the ocean's pull became stronger, more insistent. In the final moments, just before the sea took her completely, Dane pressed a kiss to her forehead, the taste of salt and tears mingling on his lips. "I'll find you again," he vowed, though he knew she could no longer hear him. "No matter what it takes, I'll find you." And as the last of her silvery form disappeared into the black depths, Dane was left alone in the heart of the trench, his heart breaking but resolute. The ocean had claimed her, but it would never take away the love they shared. It would never take away the memory of her. As he floated in the endless dark, the pulse of the sea around him, Dane knew one thing for certain: the ocean had lost its claim on his heart. That was his to keep forever.